Great. Welcome everyone to the very first CVC meeting actually of all time. And this is the Regenerative Finance Constitutional Voter Committee Subcommittee meeting, April 4th, 2023. I am your moderator for these meetings. My name is Kianga, and it's really quite a privilege and an honor to get to kick off this meeting with all of you, who many of whom I have known over the past year plus in my previous work as a recognized delegate. And so I hope that as your host and moderator, I can be helpful for those who are OGs and people who might be curious to check out MakerDAO for the very first time since the passage of the Endgame Constitution last, was it just last week? So I want to first thank the teams that have been working just tirelessly and magically around the clock for such a long time to get us to this moment, and for all of the support that you've shown the MakerDAO's community in proposing regenerative finance as a theme for a constitutional voter committee. And of course, all the setup and the interpretation of the constitutional rules and, rallying to, help us today host this call. So I just want to say thank you. I have not a presentation. I just put together, let's see, how do I do this? You all are going to bear with me as your moderator for these meetings. And I wanted to let me adjust. See, this is why, Peyton, you just saved me this morning, because you could tell I was in a panic because I'm not great at this stuff. And Retro also, so glad that you're here. So just to back up, because we'll have hopefully a whole mix of people who will be on this call and watching the recording. Today marks a brand new era. It's very exciting. It's really rare. I mean, so much in crypto feels like we missed it. For many people, we missed it. We weren't there. We didn't buy Bitcoin in 2012. We didn't hear about Maker in 2017. We missed DeFi summer. We're always often, anytime anyone comes into the space, it feels like I'm so late. And then you're always hearing we're so early. And we are early in many ways, and in other ways it is late. But this meeting and all of the meetings that are going to follow the rest of this week and on is, I think, a really rare chance to get into the ground floor again on something that I am confident is going to melt faces in the space and do a lot of good in the world. And so we'll get to that, but I just wanted to give those opening remarks and say that these subcommittee meetings, and we'll talk a little bit about the minutia and the business, and we have an important topic to cover in this meeting, business topic. But I wanted to just say this is an open meeting. It's a public meeting. It will be recorded. It happens. This particular meeting for regenerative finance is a meeting specifically organized by and for MKR holders, who are really the stewards of the project officially, who hold governance that controls the on-chain workings of the protocol. And so we're gathering as MKR holders looking to direct policy and stewardship for the entire MakerDAO project, and particularly now in this pre-game phase. So that doesn't mean that others aren't welcome in this call. And I hope that as it progresses over the quarter and in the future, this will always be a call that everyone feels very comfortable to join. that has, some technical inside baseball elements and business as it will need to, but also has a space for learning and engagement and an opportunity for, this to be a gateway drug to Maker, if I can use that expression. So welcome, welcome, welcome. And I encourage comments in the chat. We'll have special, I'll pause at different times to recognize people who want to speak and who have questions, and we'll have a lot more dialogue and back and forth in this meeting than just me talking. But let's see, what have I done? Have I done something to? Are you all still seeing my screen?
Yeah, we see end of slideshow at the top.
Oh, okay. Let's see, hang on. Wanted to go. Okay, great. Okay, back to this. Okay, so second bullet point. I think I did the welcome. I did a little intro. It's like whether this is your first time ever coming to a Maker meeting or you built the place, everyone is welcome. And everyone also is on somewhat equal footing because this is all really, really new. I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of months following and trying to prepare. So I feel okay-ish about what's been published in the Constitution and the scope frameworks. I'm trying to keep up, but don't it all feel like intimidated if it's not clear and it seems like really, really hard to grasp because you've got both how the system works today plus what's envisioned in this new organizational restructuring and then the changes that are coming. And so the pre-game period is technically now through when the official end game state will become ratified. So just briefly what that means is that we've got, the next 6, 12, 18 months to refine the Constitution itself, to make iterative changes and really have the training wheels on for how the community believes that this project and protocol and all of its elements should be kind of maintained in perpetuity to a point. So we'll talk throughout these meetings a little bit about pre-game, which is this phase we're in now, and how that's maybe different than this end game state we're trying to get to. So later on in this meeting, as we talk about the stability and liquidity scope and some of the technical details, even like the context of this meeting and how these meetings will run. And if you're an MKR holder that's interested in refi, like how do you join this committee and all of those details, just know that we're all figuring it out. And it's really great that we can just kick off, develop muscle memory. There's a lot of things that are in flight. And so the role of this meeting today is definitely going to evolve. Like it's a shadow of what it will be in the future. And so we'll just be, kind of doing it together. The context, though, is really important. So MakerDAO has adopted a constitution. Many of you know this, obviously, and it's on the forums. And this meeting and being a constitutional voter committee is part of a set of provisions that define constitutional conserver roles. So I won't get into that, but I just wanted to flag that at the beginning, that there's a special dynamic with this meeting of how governance will operate under the endgame, in the endgame era. I'll just leave it there for now. But I want to make sure, and Retro help me with this in this meeting, that if there are participants in this meeting who are constitutional delegates, I want to make sure to note your attendance at this meeting. We haven't yet sort of, I guess, spun up exactly who's raising their hand to do that and what their forum names necessarily will be. We'll work all that out in the wash, but I wanted to make sure that we just do have a record of that. So if you're here as a constitutional delegate, if you will, note that in the chat. It looks like Retro's giving me the thumbs up, so we'll be sure to make a note that you are present. And the reason that matters, so here we're on, just to show you where we are on the list on the screen. The third bullet point, constitutional conserver roles. Second sub-bullet, responsibilities and opportunities. All right, so we have this dynamic that in future meetings, I think we can spend more time talking about the big picture and some of the dynamics and intentions behind the Constitution. I think we'll save that for future meetings. But basically, we have this relationship between the groups of MKR holders that organize for these CVC meetings and set policy, as it were. And then a very interesting setup for constitutional delegates who execute the votes, who have the power to actually change the protocol, because, you know, they have wallets with MKR dedicated, sort of delegated to those wallets, and will choose which CVCs, which voter committee strategies they as delegates will follow. And so the presentation over time to MKR holders is it's a little bit dynamic in the sense that, you know, we want to put forward a policy and a point of view that's from maker holders for other maker holders to decide, okay, yeah, I'm aligned with those groups of maker holders. And that's not even an exclusive thing, right? So we have Regenerative Finance, others have proposed a Keep It Simple Stupid CVC, a growth CVC, a composable or a composability CVC. I mean, it's really been exciting to see the enthusiasm on the forum. But we're going to get a lot of trial with this. And delegates, though, it's very important that there are sufficient, I guess, CVCs fully operational, very stably running, so that delegates can fulfill responsibilities. So still on that bullet, responsibilities and opportunities, there are weekly meetings CVCs are required to host, and delegates have their own kind of terms in which they're required to attend a certain number of those CVC meetings, and quarterly publications from this group on each of the scopes. We'll talk a little bit about one of those scopes today, and an overall policy statement. And that policy statement's really important because that's going to kind of be the guidepost for the delegates on how to advise the CVCs, how to advise MKR holders on implementation for their visions or for their priorities. And it's also a way to kind of gauge, well, are the votes happening in line with, you know, how we would like to see the protocol and the project evolve. And so along with that, for both the Constitutional Voter Committee members and the delegates, the constitutional delegates, there's a scheme for compensation and some rewards, but again, that's sort of like detailed in the Constitution and the scopes. But I just wanted to note that because there is, you know, that business element of this meeting, and we can, of course, get into the substance of it when we get to those scopes this quarter in this meeting. So I think I've probably said enough on sort of a TLDR with refi CVC. We did publish a draft of the policy statement. It's a Google Doc. It's linked in one of the the refi CVC creation forum posts. I won't take the time to kind of, you know, review that or read that here. You can find that link. And it's an open document. Anyone can comment on it. We thought it would just be helpful to put something out there. And that's something we'll be looking to actually ratify at the end of the quarter. And so it initially just sort of talks about the vision for this CVC, and very important to say this, which is while MakerDAOs is a tokenized network of refi projects and impact DAO participants, we've got members from all over the world. We as members, as a member, founded the CVC, but the CVC is regenerative finance, right? It's not specific to MakerDAOs. You know, we wanted to put a group together that would attract anyone who's interested in regenerative economy themes, and most importantly, the public good purpose that's been codified in the Constitution. So that's super exciting. You can expect that this is a group that's going to pay a lot of attention to that, want to talk about what that means. The purpose fund that's been allocated, what is that all about? What is that going to look like? And we can talk more about that, but absolutely anyone is welcome to comment on that policy statement. And that will be working on over the course of the quarter. And in addition to that, those MKR holders who want to join this committee, bear with us, because I think we're, as a community, just sort of working out the rules and how some of the dynamics work around voting, to just make sure we're all on the same page about how adding members will work. So we're excited and ready to do that. We'll just follow the discussion on the forum about when we'll implement that. So, all right, the chat has 19 notifications that I haven't looked at. So I'm going to pause. And if there's anyone, I'm going to look through the chat. If anyone wants to speak at this time, feel free to raise your hand as I scroll through. I see Rune is here. Welcome. I haven't seen I haven't read anything. I'm looking at the chat right now, but the next thing that I want to do is dive into the scope that's in focus for this meeting, which is stability and liquidity scope. And I want to give Rune an opportunity to intro that topic. But before then, I'm just looking at the chat. Feel free to raise your hand if you want to voice your comment, question, anything from what we've covered so far. If you want to do that on the recording, please go ahead and raise your hand. Give you a minute to do that. Oh, it's so nice to see everyone here. Hello, hello, hello. Aren't we so excited for Endgame? Okay, no hands are being raised. I'm seeing some, looks like just back and forth chat, nothing maybe particular for me to cover as far as intro. So, okay. Rune, could I impose on you to Robot Kianga? I'm sorry, I'm in the country. I may have to go to a different place. Okay, I'm seeing. All right, I'm going to work on that. My connection. Turn off my camera. Is that better?
Yeah, it's intermittent, so we'll watch it.
All right, I will get that fixed for the future. Oh, good, Rune. Okay. All right. Well, hopefully it wasn't absolutely horrible, and it was will be legible for the recording. Rune, would you like to say a few words? I know that we are going to really encourage lots of participants on these calls, but I think that to kick off, just a high level presentation of what the stability and liquidity scope is in context, and then maybe if you could outline the specific changes that are happening around merging the 12 scopes into 5, and then this particular focus on asset liability management and the advisory councils, and how we really, as a practical matter, want this to come together quite quickly. And apologies to others who are new on the call. This is going to be probably a little bit hard to follow, but we do want to just dive right in on some of the things that need to be taken care of as we transition right at the beginning to the end game. Okay. Okay, Rune doesn't want to come. Okay, good. Okay, good. Thank you. You're helping. It's a help. It's a help. Because I think we just also need, with everything that's been going on, I think it would be great to just have that overview. because all may have not had a chance to, follow along and read. And then it will be a bit easier, I think, for people to, pick up and provide the feedback. Because as a group for regenerative finance, we will be thinking over the course of the quarter, what we'd like to see in the stability and liquidity scope. But let's first maybe just cover what's there, what's likely to be coming up for a vote this month. And or anyone else who has thoughts or who would want to give your view. Peyton, do you want to just say talk a little bit about that topic of how the scopes are combining, maybe just give an overview of what's happening there as a warm-up or as an intro? Okay, cool. And of course, anyone else who feels no, I don't hear Varun. Don't hear you. Anyone else who wants to take a stab at
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So then I'll talk a little bit, but what I'm hoping is I can say a few things and then see if we can get some more people involved.
Great.
Actually, I think the first thing to maybe talk about would be delegates and kind of their role in CVCs, right? Because it looks like there's some delegates that indicated they would like to sort of have their attendance to this CVC officially recognized, right? And by the way, that delegates get their compensation based on attendance to CVC subcommittee meetings of any kind, right? Doesn't have to be the ones they follow, like the two specific ones they follow. In fact, since they got to follow it, they've got to attend at least 4 per week, then you're always going to be attending some that you don't actually follow the strategy of, simply because that's just like still work as a delegate, right? You got to be on top of governance, right? But then in particular, if you as a delegate want to follow a particular CVC, such as refi, then a really good idea to sort of distinguish yourself would, is to then support the CVC, right? And this job of like delegates sort of being entities that do research and sort of simplify and explain and translate deep governance to something more simple and easier to and sort of more convenient for CVC members. That's really that's a key part of the job, right? And especially that's also how as a delegate you can distinguish yourself, right? Because you don't have many options to do that otherwise, right? Because the whole thing with delegates is they're mostly like banned from campaigning and doing stuff outside of the CVCs. So in that context, I just think that's I definitely personally plan to delegate to all of the CVCs, right? But especially also the refi CVC and delegates that follow that strategy. And if you want to sort of, if there's, there could very easily be multiple delegates that want to follow refi. And then what I'm going to be looking at, and what I expect others that also have the same, that are interested in, maximizing the effectiveness and sort of the functioning of maker governance, they'll be looking at, okay, if there's a delegate that is actively sort of like making the CVC more well functioning, then that's the one you want to be delegating to, right? Because that also means that they get more resources, and then they don't take all those resources for themselves, they also actually give them back by making the CVCs better, right? And okay, so one of the really obvious ways that Kianga and others from MakerDAO and the refi CVC could sort of tap into the value of delegates would be to have them help like sort of draft basically the actual elements for like and help draft the actual scope framework position paper. So in just a second, I'm going to talk about like a specific element and stuff, like specific stuff I think should be changed in the stability and liquidity scope, or rather where the focus should be. And then it could just be it could be a really good form of like early synergy between CVCs and delegates, to have delegates then help with how to then actually sort of do the work of writing it, right? So as a CVC member, you can kind of just sit back and be like, this is our opinion. And then delegates will be like, okay, does this language here, like does this element here, does this work reflect your opinion sort of written down and implemented? Again, to sort of try to make it more convenient. Does that make sense? First, or was that too rambly? Give me some feedback.
I definitely followed. Certainly welcome other folks on the call who are thinking about constitutional delegate work to chime in. But yeah, that was good. Good to have that overview.
Yeah, I mean, in all cases, I just think that it's a good way to think about sort of moving forward. Then I would expect that every CVC, especially every one of these early CVCs, will get at least one delegate that becomes kind of like, you know, that is like the delegate, a delegate that really tries to sort of you know, be very helpful, particularly to this CVC, right? And then sort of stand out as being, this is a delegate that's always on the call, that's always providing materials, always providing input, always supporting with, you know, tapping into their deep knowledge of all the specialized stuff to help the maybe newcomers to understand something complicated and so on. So well, I think there's a, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that I'm really glad you brought up this topic, because I think you know, one thing that's maybe not super clear is the CVCs have a lot to quote unquote do, right? There's like these quarterly papers and position documents, but yet we've designed this architecture to help solve a problem, which is governance participation, and to solve a problem of, you know, your typical MKR holder that's not in the weeds. You know, how can the token holders more effectively participate? And so in my mind, by design, you're not looking to set up CVC membership as, you know, this huge lift, right? And that the compensation has been geared more toward the delegates. The compensation that CVC members are eligible for is really, you know, kind of nominal. And we imagine that MKR holders participating, and this is certainly the case for members of MakerDAOs, you know, they're full-time on other stuff, like they've got other jobs, they're founders of their own projects. But Maker is important for any number of reasons, and certainly what you've described is kind of, and maybe there's other elements within the ecosystem, facilitators or the advisory councils we'll talk about, but the idea is that all of that will kind of come together so that the MKR holders who are participating in this meeting and voting on the policy documents, you know, really we're being informed through these meetings and in other parts of, I guess, what we'll develop in terms of the physical materials and the technology, the user interfaces and what have you, the AI learning modules we're excited about. But I think that's something I wanted to get clear on as we were spinning up some of the early CVCs. Like, where does the staffing or where does the time and the expertise come in to actually, for the CVCs to have all of these documents at the end of the quarter? So I think you really covered that very well. Does anyone else want to speak to that? Any of the former recognized delegates who are on the call want to, or others who are here who've already joined as CVC members? Raphael, great. Take it away.
Yeah, we are currently still debating what's the best route for Flipside to take in the new paradigm. Constitutional delegate is certainly on the table. There is some issues around the anonymity requirements that we have to kind of sort through. But I think to Runa's point, which was I think was really interesting, is the role of the delegate as basically submitting proposals of policy. Like for instance, in the current session about the liquidity scope, I, for instance, could propose that D3Ms are exempt of this the yield requirement, right? Like the basically the Federal Reserve should not govern the yields that D3Ms then have to fulfill, because then we can use D3Ms as these tools to kind of push DAI outside to the wider ecosystem, which I think is aligned with Maker's overall goal. So is that like the role that delegates should perform in the new paradigm, like these kind of very concrete proposals on how to change the scopes?
Yeah, so can I respond to that, because I just think that is,
go ahead. Yeah,
that's like, so so it's really good you brought that up, right? Because it's a really good sort of discussion to have, right? But basically, I would say that that's a good example of what the delegates should not be doing, or rather, what they shouldn't be. I mean, actually, of course, in this early stage, it's not that simple, and I can be like that. That like there could easily be very compelling reasons why something like that would still make sense. But kind of for the most part, right? The whole point is that the delegates aren't the ones that bring the kind of the vision, right? And I would say, like, basically the argument you just made there, I would definitely consider that a sort of vision-based argument, right? There's something like the Federal Reserve and like, rather, and this is actually what I want to talk about with the advisory councils, right? That delegates, they're basic, they're not expected to be experts in economics or monetary policy or something like that, right? They're basically experts in maker governance and maker politics, right? So often what they can really offer is, translating some external stuff, like some external facts or some external knowledge into like maker governance and maker politics compatible language, for instance. Yeah, so that's one thing, right? So then the second thing is the advisory councils. They are basically the place where, look, this is where like all CVCs and so the DAO as a whole, they really try to hire these actual experts to then make sort of concrete proposals to sort of overhaul the scopes and add a bunch of new rules about stuff. And this is really like the point I really wanted to make, and that I made on the test run as well, and I made on this forum post before this call, right? Is that the CVCs in general, they should just actually pretty much always, but especially in the beginning, the early stage, their concern should be, how to hire the advisory councils, what to tell them, like what should we tell them to do, how should we pay them, how do we make sure they actually do what we want them to do. Like that should be like that should be the focus, I think, and trying to kind of go beyond that and jump directly into fixing stuff here and there and making changes here and there. Like the point is exactly that CVC simply can't do that, and delegates, even shouldn't do that. Like it's sort of even like in sort of an extreme case, it's sort of unconstitutional in a sense for delegates to like. If delegates are actually I'm not talking about this specific case of D3Ms or whatever, like, but it's more like sort of the point is that the delegates are never meant to be these like, they're not meant to be this role that sort of injects the bias into the CVC. It's more like the CVC generates the bias, and then the delegates sort of has the actual power and then acts based on that bias if it's constitutional.
So it's more like hiring and firing of of advisory experts and making sure that the relevant stakeholders are invited to these meetings and that kind of organizational process. Is that
I
understanding
actually,
correct?
Ralph, I see it really different. I mean, I see it as substantive, but more interpretation, right? So the CVCs being empowered through this process to articulate together the MKR holders, their policies or their views, broadly speaking, and how they'd like to see them implemented at Maker. The delegates then will be the ones that really understand the scope frameworks in detail. They'll know the changes that are being proposed, and the delegates can then translate those values, those policy statements, even meetings that might, like refi CVC meetings in the future, may hardly cover in detail the way we will today the minutia of the scope frameworks. I mean, I think over time, you'd like to see that the MKR holders can come together and not need to know so much the details of the scopes. And so therefore it will be the delegates that can translate that into, okay, here are your priorities. Here are some experts, but then also here's the language, like here's the way it can be implemented. And that in fact, a single delegate, and Rune and others correct me if I've gotten this a little bit off, but that a single delegate could vote oppositely on different contracts. The same exact delegate is following different policies and they're totally agnostic as to what the result is. It's like their role is to implement the policies. And so that's going to be an unbelievably valuable skill and knowledge and talent to do that kind of intermediation. So I mean, I wouldn't frame it as like just sort of hiring and firing. I mean, it's to me a crucial role. It's just that the delegates are no longer asserting their own point of view or having a point of view per se, in terms of that particular job.
Yeah, I think that really makes that's also a good point. Which is like I wrote here, right? With like, it's like the delegates can help how to actually do something. Once you've decided something should be done, then delegates can help how to then actually do it. And of course, it's never going to be absolutely black and white, but it certainly comes back to this thing about the delegates. They have the real physical power. They have so much control of the system, and so it's just very. It's kind of a separation of powers, a separation of concerns thing, right? Where you don't want to have the ones that hold the powers to then also kind of decide what to do with that power, right? But rather you want this kind of balance of power. The CVCs, they can be a little bit, political and ideological and emotional and wanting to do different things, and who knows, get into like political factions and struggles with each other. And then the delegates ultimately can be the ones that have that power and just are sort of neutral in all this. But at a certain point can say, look, things are going too far. You can't try to use your upper hand of the voting power as a CVC to somehow like, disenfranchise the other CVC or something, right? I mean, those are the kinds of cases where delegates really need to be, like, that's truly like their job, right? Is to guard against those kinds of dangerous situations. And if that is the number one priority of their job, then they gotta stay out of like day-to-day politics, right? That's the best possible way for them to then also be reliable when it comes to that kind of edge case, that they don't get caught up in it, right? They simply help everyone regardless of they help the ones they want to help. Ultimately, it's up to them, right? But sort of the way they're allowed to distinguish themselves is by providing sort of, in a sense, of technical support and technical advice on how to do stuff with governance. Now, for this specific D3M example, because that's like a great example to just like use to get into this stuff, right? It could be something like, let's say that the CVC is saying, hey, shouldn't we like ban D3Ms or something, get rid of D3Ms, or make a bunch of restrictions on D3Ms. And that's when delegates can then be like, okay, look, that might be something you want to do, but here's a bunch of facts that we know about and that we believe to be objective facts that it's probably going to be good context to sort of consider your decision, right? And then there could be a whole bunch of like, well, here's the stuff, and it could even be like political analysis in a sense of like, look, there's certain people that will, there are other CVCs that used to sometimes ally with you to reach compromises against some third CVC. And if you do this, then you might alienate the allies you usually have and instead have another coalition that can, like that kind of stuff, right? But the important thing is, again, that delegates always kind of stay out of it, have no sort of horse in the race other than governance must, democracy or whatever, decentralized governance must be preserved, right? And then the final point I just want to make that I do think is like is a kind of good point, and that does make a lot of sense, is that the advisory councils and how to pick the advisory councils is the one area where the system gets a little bit sort of like, basically the logic that sort of applies in most other places in the system doesn't work so well when it comes to specifically the elements related to how to onboard the advisory councils, right? And that's because generally the system relies on the advisory councils for making all the rules, but then it becomes a bootstrapping, like a chicken and egg problem of like how to make the rules about how to hire the advisory councils.
Rune?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to transition to that more so in the context of the scope we're going to talk about, but I just wanted to pause and come to one thing that Paper raised in the chat to see if we could just spend 60 seconds on this topic of how MKR, the dynamic of MKR for MKR holders here. There's MKR holder that decides to join a CVC, and then there's the MKR holder that delegates, that picks a delegate. And so Paper has said delegates definitely get some choices because there's more than 2 CVCs. And if a delegate can't bring the MKR to the CVC, not much point in the CVC members not just voting themselves. A CVC that can't attract MKR from non-members seems like a lot of work for no additional clout or cut. And so my reaction to that is really very different. So I wanted to just have a little discussion and clarity, which is that a CVC is not set up, and certainly I don't think MakerDAO has set up the CVC with like some desire to specifically attract MKR. Like that's not been any focus of any internal discussion. And so I'm just wondering, how do you see it, Rune, in the dynamic here? And this idea of like delegates attracting CVC, attracting MKR versus the CVCs attracting the MKR, and just sort of, can you give us some, and others in Paper, if you want to comment how you guys are viewing it at GFX or others, because that's something I think is a little bit unclear.
Yeah, I can just make 2 points. So the first one is that I do think that, at least, I mean, the way I would view it, if I was like running a CVC and sort of had an opinion about this is what's going to be best for governance and this is what's going to be best for the public good purpose of Maker and so on, it would then definitely be that a part of that is figuring out how to attract MKR voters, right, and get voting power, because otherwise it's kind of like RAI or something, right, where it's great you've got a fully decentralized stablecoin, but it doesn't really impact many people. And it's sort of the same thing with like a CVC that has some amazing purpose, but it doesn't really actually, like it doesn't really end up being able to implement that purpose, right? So I do think, I mean, and I certainly expect, and this is, I was referencing this a little bit before, that like you have in particular delegates help out CVCs with like realpolitik, right? Like how to actually compromise on the ideology towards sort of getting some of the key sort of what you actually value implemented to the extent that is possible, by also like forming alliances with other CVCs and all of that stuff. Anyway, so that's one thing. I just think that that's like, I mean, of course it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, you can get compensation as a CVC member, or rather your compensation as a CVC member is not impacted by how much voting power you've got. It's only impacted by how much MKR you've got. So
Right.
it actually, there's no incentive actually for a CVC if it's just sort of purely selfishly motivated to attract MKR. Then the other point I just want to quickly make is that it's this whole system is set up for incentivized voting, or incentivized delegation, right? And one of the consequences of that is that probably all CVCs can expect to get some voting power, like, because there will just be a percentage of voters that will just vote at random. And in addition to that, there's just going to be so many people that like delegate, and so often it will be like whatever pops up at the top, and that is actually determined by what the delegates pick, right? Like in the current system, it's going to be that the delegates decide, they pick 2 CVCs, and then it'll be like whatever CVCs are picked most by the delegates, they will be the CVCs that will get a lot of the incentivized votes when they come in. But of course, there's also going to be this like sort of meta game to it, where you're going to see some upside if you're a delegate that picks a CVC that the others aren't really picking, because then there are going to be people like seeing the list and like, well, this is lame, and then scrolling down like, oh, here's something interesting, and then they're going to delegate to that, right? And yeah, I mean, my point is just like, it's really important to think about the incentivized front end when thinking about voting power. And we actually, it's hard to predict so much about it, I think. Like, we'll have to kind of see it in action.
Okay, I think that clarifies a lot for me. So I get where it makes sense for CVCs to kind of care about the MKR delegated to the delegates that follow them, but the compensation or rewards for the CVC members is based on the amount of MKR that's in the CVC. So and really the rewards is not set up to be a big driver for how the CVCs will operate and the members will participate. I think maybe it's unique for refi in that it's so purpose focused that, you know, the sentiment right now, it may shift, is kind of like just having a presence in the structure and being able to, you know, articulate the values and, you know, hopefully attract people who've been really active in regenerative finance is like a huge reward for those who are engaged at this time. But yeah, I see the point though, and I think we'll just learn how these dynamics shake out. But I like, you know, the gamification of this whole new governance structure is really powerful. And I think the sense of kind of competition among the Constitutional Conservers is going to be interesting. Let's see, I just want to address, JS has asked the question about recruiting for the advisory council. And that's a great segue to circle back, Rune, on discussing the advisory councils, because I will say that for myself as moderator, I'd sort of interpreted the scopes as saying it's the facilitators and maybe the delegates who are going to be recommending recruits for that, and that as a CVC member, we'll just be on our throne, like voting or saying, oh, we don't like. But if that's not right, like let's get into that now. Like, who should be thinking about advisory council members, and also Rune, like, and others who are on the call, in terms of the stuff that's in flight right now. What needs to be practically done, or what can any of us on this call practically do, because we have actually, you know, some billions in value locked up in a project and a stable coin that needs looking after. So we can't take all quarter to figure this out. So let's go ahead and dive into the advisory councils and the ALM conversation as well, because it's 10 minutes to the hour. We'll try and hold these calls maximum 90 minutes. So really we will have a hard stop in 40 minutes. So Rune, do you want to address a little bit now more where you were going with the advisory councils and the merging of the scopes and all that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a one thing one of the point I was getting at before when I was talking about advisory councils is that it's really like a hotbed for conflict of interest and complexity and drama and politics and so on. And I mean, you even got Payton just made this comment that, like, for instance, CVCs might want to try to bias the councils towards whatever they support and so on, right? And of course, as with everything else in the system, the idea is that it needs to be sort of checks and balances everywhere, and that the advisory councils sort of serve a completely, like, just like delegates, advisory councils do not have some kind of ideological or bias in how they work, and they're just merely professionals getting paid to sort of do, you know, professional fact-based objective analysis and so on, right? But before I go a little bit more into that again and how delegates and sort of facilitators tie into that, I just want to talk first about this sort of broader point of like how CVCs are meant to basically be restricted from participating in governance, or sort of where the boundary goes of like what can a CVC do and what can it do. And I think maybe this is not even, this is certainly the sort of the intent of how I discussed them in the past and how I tried to write things related to this in the Constitution. But it may be that there's actually missing like specific language about this that I really will want to put in there because it's such an important point, right? And basically it's that like CVCs are absolutely not meant to be able to kind of micromanage, right? They should not be able to be like, oh, we're going to write in our position paper that Maker should totally hire my cousin, right? I mean, I keep using this cousin example because it's just sort of the most banal and obvious way that you'll get misalignment, right? That if somebody sits and controls all the money, and then they get to decide where that money is going to be spent, there's a, you know, you're not going to be happy if you find out later that it turns out that they happen to determine that the best supplier happened to be their friend or their family member or something, right? So for CVCs, that's like a particular, you know, CVCs have very low barrier to entry, and you can't really like get rid of them easily. So you just, and they just serve a different role. So you just don't want them in the, like, making a specific decision about like hiring this or hiring that advisory council member, or sort of, or especially being like, let's push to hire this one specifically, right? And then the idea is instead of then how do the CVCs then influence? I mean, what's then the point of all this stuff I want to talk about, right? And it's basically that instead of defining who to hire based on saying, let's hire that company, basically it should be like, and this is a typical thing in like government procurement, for instance, right? It should be this like, let's describe the requirements. Like, we need someone who's got, you know, this type of experience, and they're like, they got, you know, this type of capabilities, and it needs to be a team or a single person or whatever, and they need to both be able to do A and B, and they need to be whatever, right? So ultimately, if there, let's say there is a CVC member that has a cousin that happens to know ALM, it should be perfectly viable to like set up a completely fair process that analyzes people based on like skills and objective stuff. And then that CVC member's cousin should be able to participate in that process. But the outcome of the process ideally should be whoever is the best and most capable ends up being the one that you know, gets proposed by the facilitator to get onboarded to the advisory council, for instance, right? And then you've got multiple like checks and balances here, right? So one is kind of the intention of the CVC members, right? So they'll say, we need someone who can do ALM, and we need someone who we can trust to not push all sorts of other projects on us before doing the LM. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen that, but I've got a bit of like, I don't know, anxiety about that. Well, maybe it's just more like my general paranoia that I really believe that it's so important to like prioritize suppliers and really be clear about priorities, right? But I mean, so the CVCs might sort of explain that and form that opinion, right? And then delegates are the ones that can then, especially when it comes to specifically the advisory council elements, I think delegates are really the ones that are very well suited to then help translate the opinion of the CVC members into, what about this specific language? Do you think that covers, like, so you're saying have ALM skills? Well, how would you write that? Does that mean have done ALM jobs in the past? Does it mean banking experience? Does it mean blah, blah, this type of diploma or this type of company credentials, or, you know, the kind of the practical stuff, right? Then ultimately the CVC can then decide to sort of like take that advice or even develop it itself. It could also just be a CVC member just decides, I'll just do it myself. I'll write the things myself and propose that. And the delegates and the CVC members can work together to then ultimately come up with something that the CVC members think this is a good, like, these are some good elements that we want to put in our position document for this scope, right? And then once the elements are in the position document, it's sort of, the ball is out of the CVC's court, right? Like they don't control the process beyond what language they put into the scope framework, and then instead it falls with the facilitator, and then the facilitator, basically then decides how to interpret that and go out and propose someone to get onboarded as an advisory council member. And then once someone is proposed to be onboarded as an advisory council member, it sort of goes back to the CVCs again and the delegates again, in that they still have to be ratified. They can't just be sort of automatically onboarded. And I think this like ratification process, that is like one of the, I mean, and this is why this advisory council members are so tricky, right? That there will certainly be some kind of politics and so on in that, but I think it'll be more like you'll have, it'll be more like each of the major factions will make sure that they're going to start like sort of trolling in a sense if they feel like there's too much bias in this other direction. We're not just going to shut down, even if they sort of objectively fulfill all the credentials, we're going to find a reason to shut them down anyway, right? But as long as that's not the case, then I would expect that like the ratification thing is going to be more like a check on the facilitator than not hiring their cousin, for instance. Okay, so the same thing also applies to like the incubated ecosystem actors and those elements in the ecosystem scope. I just hope that the logic I'm describing here, right, of like that the CVCs can, they through the position documents determine the language, but there's a limit. They can't determine individuals. They can't write an individual company like directly into the scope framework, right? That would be the wrong way to do it and would be unconstitutional. And it's generally a problem if the CVC members try to like micromanage through force of votes, right? And instead it's about creating these objective processes.
So do we want to talk about stability and liquidity in particular, how it's proposed to be combined with decentralized collateral, real world assets, and how we're going to kick off? It is the idea that we should start some process to hire some advisors, and who should be leading that specifically right now, just curious. And then of course, in the context of this meeting, what would the expectation be for this CVC to weigh in on at the end of the quarter?
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about the scope merging first. So basically the scope merging is like, in some ways it's like a consequence of the responsibilities of MakerCore becoming more and more simplified with kind of the latest iterations of how much sub-DAOs can actually do, which has been pushed to the limit now, right? Well, almost all responsibilities will lay with the sub-DAOs, and very little will lay with MakerCore, which just makes MakerCore a lot nicely simple. And then one of the upsides of that is that, especially when it comes to what used to be by far the most complicated stuff, which was collateral management, it's just like simple enough that basically, I mean, it's sort of my original kind of bias, or whatever you want to call it, my original sort of belief that it would simply be too complex to try to cover all collateral management with a single scope, and not kind of forcing to sort of slice it up in some more subdivided elements. But I think that's no longer the case, because it's so simplified with allocators and how they work, like the allocators DAO system. So then that just like enabled me to then like combine all, I mean, basically once I got rid of that sort of dogma, essentially, then I could combine the scopes into what they sort of naturally, what I think is actually their natural state of like basically having a bunch of like scopes that, of the 12 scopes, a lot of them are like very similar and sort of grouped together. And for collateral management, that's basically stability, liquidity, decentralized collateral, and real asset collateral. And then it's actually pretty simple to like merge the scopes, but there's one thing that's like a little bit tricky, but also helps us in like preparing for merging these scopes. And that is the advisory councils, right? Because of course the advisory councils are like all about covering sort of the language of the scopes themselves, and what happens if you got like 3 separate advisory councils and you want to merge them and so on. I mean, I guess actually that's not even necessarily that difficult, but we have the opportunity to immediately kind of merge the advisory councils up front, so that we're fully set for a very easy merge of the other scopes. So as a result, what I basically propose is that when we talk about the stability and liquidity scope, and we talk about the advisory council for the stability and liquidity scope, we think in terms of actually this future stability scope that covers all collateral management, and the changes that we want to implement will be implemented in the decentralized collateral scope, because that's where the stability advisory council, like the thing that ends up becoming a stability advisory council, would be sitting, specifically because that's the place in the, like, that's the scope of the 3 collateral management related scopes where there already is an active advisory council member, which is the old risk team, right? Block Analytica. Yeah, so basically that's, sorry,
on
go ahead.
point, could you speak to, some weeks ago we were talking about advisory councils and a DVC, decentralized voter committee meeting, and this idea of them being like an expert network. So this is a spectrum and how to conceptualize a council, right? I mean, like the risk team, they're technically playing this advisor role, but that's a whole team that's full-time on task, versus a kind of expert network that's sort of on standby, and you tap someone in that network when you have a very particular sort of RFP around an isolated issue. So how are we conceiving of this council, or the councils, or the advisors in that spectrum of like just expert network, we tap for opinion on this or that, a project-based kind of paid report or consult, versus the other end, which is how the risk team, the old risk core unit team and their new iteration are engaging?
Yeah, so I think it's easiest to just, at least for this like first wave of talking about ALM, which I think is should be the top priority. But before I get to that, then for now, I think we should set the old like block analytica and the old risk teams aside, because the way that the scopes are made to sort of accommodate this transition of the old core units into the scopes is that they're basically implementing something that looks really like a core unit just in the scopes. And then the idea is to slowly turn them into proper project-based funding. So block analytica is not a good example of how any other advisory council member we onboard should function, because they've got like multiple responsibilities all over the place. They got this like, you know, recurring budget, and then a huge amount of the work will be related to all the sort of legacy stuff like native vaults and all this stuff that they have to sort of help transition and wind down and deal with on an interim basis and so on. Of course, they certainly will actually probably be, I mean, they'll be able to be helpful and for instance, do stuff related to like stablecoin exposure. And I know they've already done stablecoin exposure stuff that is actually very, very relevant for ALM and sort of a key component of like the ALM considerations. I mean, because of how you sort of audit, I mean, sort of this whole thing of like, where do you automate when you get assets in? How do you put those assets like automatically, right? That's the central. I mean, I think that's like I think the central priority of all the CVCs as they look at how to deal with, you know, the collateral management related scope frameworks in the short run. I mean, or rather like just priority number one should be to like get a sense of like how important it is to understand what to do with ALM and what to do with this question of we getting a bunch of assets coming in. How do we deal with that? Or maybe we have an outflow of demand. Where do we take the collateral from to accommodate that outflow? And right now, basically, the mechanism for that is like very crude and sort of just made by me, basically arbitrarily, based on some very like rough translation of this original report made by the old real asset team a long time ago. And so I don't think that there's like I mean, the CVC should not be responsible for like trying to fix this in the short run or try to rush towards it, because that's actually also not, it's not that urgent in that sense. Like, and the whole point is that's the wrong approach, right? What the CVC should focus on is like how to get confidently on top of this for the long run, because that is absolutely the number one thing where if we can confidently get on top of that for the long run and get set up in a way where we feel like we're very proactive about this now, and sort of the broader community and the broader CVCs, they really got a sense of ALM and they know they've got experts and they know who to trust and they know how to pay someone to do some work related to that and how much to pay them and what to tell them to do the work and so on, right? That's really what I think is like, I mean, I think that should be the top priority. And then the specific thing that that also brought up on the test run, right, was this, okay, I don't know why that happened. I sent it as a direct message. It's really weird. But anyway, so this element in the stability and I guess actually that should be the decentralized collateral scope. It could be any scope because all the the advisory council rated articles are pretty much identical currently. But so 1.3.1, right, in the decentralized collateral scope, that is the element that determines like how responsible facilitators are supposed to sort of look at the budget they've got available for advisory council projects and then go out and sort of spend that budget on getting work done. And right now it just says if they deem it necessary. And then what we can do is we can make something like 1.3.1.1 and 1.3.1.2 and so on. That are these sub-elements that say, I mean, for instance, I think number one thing should be, if we don't have a strong ALM framework in place and we haven't done an update recently, that's the number one thing. And then 1.3.1.2 could say something like, don't spend money and get distracted by doing other stuff if ALM isn't properly dealt with yet. And I'm just saying this, and like, I mean, then ideally the CVCs sit down and think and kind of really nerd out about this to the extent possible of like how to really phrase that in a good way. That, you know, let's assume the facilitators are malicious, right? I mean, that's always a good place to start, to sort of assume that they're going to try to like game this somehow and hire their cousin, right? I mean, that they're not actually going to, but we need to be prepared for future where they're fully anonymous and we don't know if we can trust them, right? And we need to just generally be resilient, and just, this is just the way to think in endgame, right? You need to think adversarially. So the more we can really be like, get language in the scopes that describe the intention of, this is when you spend the money, and you know, and we got to make sure that when money is spent, we're getting the kind of value in return that we're looking for. And then I guess to sort of, as we did in the test run, the kind of the two opinions I would really bring to the table. So I'm not a CVC member currently, and maybe I don't even have to be. Maybe the CVCs will be able to run without me having to actually be formally CVC members, right? But if I was a CVC member, then what I would do is I would sort of try to put on the agenda of saying, look, I think we should agree in the CVC that we need to put in our position paper some strong preference for number one, making sure that if ALM isn't properly covered, then we got to be spending money on ALM. I mean, then we got to instruct the facilitator to spend CVC, like to spend advisory council budget on ALM advisory work from someone who's competent. And then number two, they can't do other stuff if the ALM thing isn't covered, because we don't want them running off with some interesting project or exciting new thing or something, right? If the basics aren't covered, and ALM is the absolute foundation for, like, you know, making sure that our system is healthy.
Yep. I think that makes sense. Any other folks want to chime in? Or comments, elaboration? Okay, so we've got 15 more. 15 more minutes or so. Do we want to say more about this topic? Does anyone have other things they want to take this opportunity while we're all together? There's no more GNR calls. There are several other CVC meetings scheduled for this week, though. Retro, I don't know if you Money Supply, thanks for coming. Cool. Retro, if there's anything from SES perspective you'd want to highlight since we're all here.
About the only update that we can share concretely right now is that we've invested some research into potential advisory council members, just to build a bench and become literate in that process. So if there's any comments on that, we're welcome to integrate that into our process, and appreciate the comments that have been made so far. But yeah, that would be probably the best progress update so far to share.
And right now, it's really the initiative of the facilitators to bring something to a vote. Like, from a constitutional perspective, can someone review for us right now what's now triggering, or who has the authority to trigger on-chain votes? So to recommend someone to actually engage them, how would we activate that today?
Yeah, the conversations come up a couple times, especially in the arena of real world assets. The guidance that we're providing is if you need help understanding if an opportunity or an action fits into the Constitution and frameworks, definitely approach us with that for assistance. If you're confident that the opportunity does fit, please move forward with a forum post then, and we'll review and move it to a vote as long as there's no constitutional boundaries that are being broken.
So it would be the facilitators right now that actually put a post that says, you know, we'd like to recommend, well, okay, I guess it could, as we talked about, right, we sort of have to get things done before we'll have this full quarter where the CVCs can weigh in about, Rune, to what you were saying, where we want to set generic requirements rather than like, hey, my uncle's cousin's really great. How is that process practically now going to unfold? And is that something that the CVC members should start? I don't know, what would we potentially do there? But, you know, also just thinking about the project-based funding tool, how do we actually do this of suggesting, here's the criteria first and foremost that a particular advisor would need to meet? Like who's drafting that? Is that what's voted on first before then there's a particular entity that's designated? How are we sequencing that?
Okay, so first of all, sorry, Rachel, you want to chime in first?
By all means, if you want to start, I can fill in any gaps.
Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is that right now, actually, well, it's SES is the stability and liquidity facilitator, I believe. So actually, right now, okay, sorry, it's a little weird actually now that I think about it. So actually, it's okay. So actually, Block Analytica. Okay, this is really weird because of how it's all set up, and that actually is something I might want to try to fix because it might not be a deal. But currently, it would be Block Analytica, so the risk team, that have the ability to at any time propose the onboarding of any advisory council member to do ELM or any other random stuff. And they sort of, I mean, and I posted some relevant elements in the chat here, right? So first you got 1.2.1 that says that so what this means is Block Analytica has a mandate, but I mean, there's not a time frame given, right? But supposedly Block Analytica should post on the forum or something saying this is how you apply to be an advisory council member for decentralized collateral, which will then later be renamed to Stability Advisory, Stability Advisory Council member, right? And once they've made that open, like that defined this open process, then people could make applications, right? And then, I mean, there's been some chatter in the past of like Kroll, for instance, is like a sort of a big professional company, right? That have actually shown interest in doing this kind of work for Maker, right? Then there could be this would actually then mean that then they would have to make a post following this process. And if they did that, then based on 1.2.3, then Block Analytica could then say, okay, there was this proposal, we deem it necessary, or whatever. Let me see what it is. Oh, we have found it to be suitable, and then as a result, you will go to a vote. So that could happen at any time currently. Like that could happen, I don't know, almost tomorrow, I think. I'm not sure this how time frames are. Yeah, it doesn't seem like there's any time frame really given. So yeah, it doesn't even say yeah, I mean, there's definitely some optimizations that are needed there, right? But basically it could happen immediately that an advisory council comes on board. Of course, in practice, the discussions that we have in the CVCs are going to have a big impact on this, right? Because the facilitators aren't going to want to look bad for the CVCs and look like they're abusing or kind of like being being negligent with their very discretionary powers as they currently sit in terms of how to onboard someone, right? Okay, sorry.
These are the kinds of things we can be looking to put in our scope document at the end of the quarter, right? Like ratifying or specifying the timing, what the RFPs or requests actually in more detail look like. But right now we're just in a period where, they've got a lot of discretion, and we'll see how it plays out until the voting process gets things implemented and specified in the scopes over the various months.
Yeah, I mean, so the second point I want to make, right, is that so this is where really the true phase of CVCs reveals themselves, right? Because CVCs are not going to be very fast-moving entities or sort of things, right? Like they can't even do anything on this until the end of the quarter, and even then, it'll just be here and now the kind of the guidelines, and then someone has to be onboarded, and then there'll probably be another quarter to like figure out who to then really go with. And so it could be that something that's decided now doesn't even get in motion until 6 months from now. And of course, likely it could very well be faster than that. And then it would be based on the facilitators kind of reading the room and being like, okay, we get the sense of where this is going, and we can't just like sit around and play bureaucratic masochism either, right? And just use the process as an excuse for not doing anything, but instead use the the discretionary powers we got available to then get some stuff done in the interim, right? But basically, and this is also, I mean, so there's two kind of things to get out of that, right? And the first one is this first quarter. This is the first thing you said, Kianga. One of the first things was this first quarter is really about muscle memory, right? The goal should be to get comfortable with CVCs. It should not be to get something done with CVCs. Like getting things done, that's going to be through the monthly cycle with MIP 102, right? Which is kind of this like, can edit anything and do all sorts of stuff, right? And it's very fast and very powerful, while the CVC is very slow and has a lot of checks and balances, right? But the second point is then, and this is the point I was making earlier, is in the end, the objective should be to set ourselves up for the proactive long run, right? The pre-game, you'll have me and like facilitators and former core units and so on. They will be doing lots of like reactive stuff and getting things done and setting things up and bootstrapping stuff. But then they'll go away eventually, right? And like MIP 102 will disappear. That's about the plan, right? And so at some point, the CVCs will be all there is, and this very slow and deliberate process will be all that remains. And in that context, then it sort of makes sense now. It actually makes perfect sense for a CVC today to think about something that we should be doing a year from now. Like, it really will be super valuable to have some very high quality ALM experts and have the kind of the knowledge of how to engage with them, having that in place a year from now, and just knowing a year from now that we're like, yes, we're on top of this now, right? And also just for the other stuff, it's just about like the first step is like building up the resources to do the things proactively. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, and if I could add a little color for just 60 seconds, the stability and liquidity scope is one of the more developed frameworks that we've inherited so far. So that's really put us in a good position, especially before the vote was executed, to go out, perform some of this research and actions firsthand to see and answer the questions that I think JS brought up, which is like, what skills are we looking for? What like specific requirements through that process? Then CVCs play a major role in helping shape that. So from my point of view, being an end game for a week, the more CVCs can ask questions and the more CVCs can distill into the frameworks, it makes the workforce's job a whole lot easier. And then over time, we'll look to say, take a good application process from one framework and try to introduce that across the DAO in a consistent manner. So we don't have 12 bespoke systems for running applications. As an example, it's a built-in maturity tool that we'll look to leverage again from that governance design point of view.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Want to give a shout out to Naomi in the room, who is a refi warrior who I stalk on Twitter and harass her because she's got such great insight into the refi space and doing really incredible work. And so just want to thank you, Naomi, for coming and staying on this entire maker call. I don't know how interesting it was. I'll chat with you after. And there may be others who I don't directly know on the call and who were on earlier that may have seen some of our tweets about spinning up a refi CVC, and MakerDAO is getting involved. And so I'm just really grateful for this community that's been here, that I've been a part of for a little while, and all the support that all of you have given to a refi CVC being on the team. So any last comments from anyone before we close out? We'll be back, same bat time, same bat channel next week. There'll be some post on the forum to kind of tee up the conversation. But I think this was not bad for our first end-game CVC kickoff.
I just have one final comment I want to make, and that is that since CVCs and this ALM question is all about the very long run, then it makes a lot of sense to think about this allocator paradigm where maker call and the scope framework doesn't actually determine sort of the operational, it doesn't try to maximize operational efficiency of ALM. It tries to solve for tail risk of ALM. That hopefully just makes it means that there's less to worry about. Like, we don't have to worry about how to make money with ALM. The allocators will figure that out. We have to worry about how to prevent things from exploding with ALM. So in the past, we had to focus on both, and now we only have to focus on one of them, and that hopefully makes it a bit simpler, and maybe also informs who to hire for the advisory council.
I'll hop on the mic real quick too. Last order of housekeeping. I think I have everybody here except maybe PBG that missed the call, but anyone that is looking to declare as a constitutional delegate for attendance and compensation, last chance to drop that into the chat now. Just to clarify, if you're intending to declare as a constitutional delegate, please state that PBG, but thank you for the follow-up.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And Rune, thank you for talking more than I know you probably wanted to on this call, but I certainly thought this was very helpful. Hope others found it a good use of time. And I hope you'll keep showing up for refi, and I hope constitutional delegates will pick us to follow. We'll try to make it fun. And I did see, sorry, I didn't get Johnny to your question about your very detailed question. I'll say refi CVC has really probably no stance on anything just yet. We will have to have a vote at the end of the quarter, but we'll be, as a community, learning a lot and hoping to get input from advisory council experts, and then giving you our high-level views for the delegates to implement. But one last thing. There'll be CVC forums. Yeah, so we'll be, I'm sure, seeing a lot of updates. There was a post from Dux on the forum about some of the new front ends and things that are coming. I guess the Discord will probably be reorganized, and yeah, I mean, there's so much in flight. I'm super excited. And okay, it's past. Everyone have a great night, afternoon, morning. If you're watching the recording, thank you for that, and see you next time.
Thank you so much for doing all the work and the MC and Kianga.
Such a pleasure. Bye, everyone.